Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Joining me on the podcast today is Akshar Patel. He is the genius behind the Emissary. We've got a link to that in the show notes. It's his own sort of website, YouTube platform, everything else. He's basically putting out content about India. I've known him for a long time just via social media, and I've always found his takes very interesting, even when I didn't agree with them. I think he's got his finger on the pulse of what's going on in India in a way that most English language publications don't have. So I'd encourage you to check him out, and I hope to have him on a little bit more regularly because, as you know, India is heading into elections, and India is one of the most important countries in the world going forward in the 2020s. And as I often joke when I give presentations, I can't make up my mind whether India is going to take over the world or whether it's going to completely collapse and fall in on itself. You can probably hear my ambivalence even in the context of this conversation. This is true of most of the topics that I discuss in the podcast, especially when it comes to something that I am not a deep expert on. But Socrates, I'm going to paraphrase him, said that the beginning of wisdom was the knowledge of your own ignorance. And when it comes to India, I'm painfully aware of my own ignorance and how long it would take to actually build true expertise here. I think you could spend a lifetime studying these things and you wouldn't be able to get to them. So I sort of view myself, often on the podcast as a proxy for you, the listener, but especially in this case, because I have a deep sense of how what's the right word, inadequate my understanding of India is, and even my own mental tools, my mental toolkit for trying to understand something. It has always felt to me like things just don't map on correctly here when it comes to India. This is true of a couple different countries. I feel this way about Japan. To a lesser extent, I feel this way about Mexico, but India is sort of first and foremost there. So I want to thank Akshar for coming on. We're going to dive a little bit deeper as we go here, and I hope you enjoy the journey. You can reach out to me at jacob@cognitive.investments if you want to talk about our investment views about India or how this relates to our own views about supply chains in India, or the advice we give to multinationals about operating in India, because all of that is part of this. You can also just email me if you want to talk about the podcast or send me book recommendations or encouragement. We've gotten a couple random emails recently just saying, love the podcast. Love you guys too. I try to respond to everything that comes through. Take care of the people you love. Cheers and see you out there. Okay, Akshar, it's a pleasure we've been corresponding for a long time over Twitter, but it's nice to know you're not a bot, that you're a real person, that there's somebody behind this whole thing. Before we get started, I want you to tell the listeners about the Emissary and where to find you, because I've been following you for a long time. I've been reading your stuff for a long time. It's helped me immensely, and I want to send some people your way. So tell people about the Emissary and where they can find you, and then we'll jump into the conversation.
Sure. So the Emissary is, it's a lot of things. It's a blog, it's a Twitter, it's a YouTube, hopefully soon a podcast. But I think the best place to find me is theemissary.co. And you could also follow me at Twitter at theemissary.co. And then YouTube, just type in the Emissary. I'll be the first thing that comes up. So those are probably the best places to find me. What the Emissary is I'm Indian American. I'm born in America. I started the Emissary because I felt there was a big disconnect between, commentary abroad on India and, what's actually happening in India. So it's mostly about Indian politics, but with politics comes history, which is very, very relevant in Indian politics, probably more so than most other places. Economics as well, a bit of theology. All these things factor in many ways, very different ways than I think abroad. I think that's what makes Indian politics very unique compared to other places. You'll see a lot of overlap, but there's also a lot of like mishmash and combinations. And it's fascinating. It's like Game of Thrones in real life. I think that's why I got so obsessed with it.
Why did you choose the name The Emissary? Is there anything special to that? I've never actually asked you that.
Dude, it just sounded cool, honestly. Like,
just sounded cool.
I started the Emissary after getting into a fight with a bunch of other Indian Americans at a party about politics. Never talk about politics, especially at a party or anything like that. And this was in the middle of, peak political polarization, late 2010s in America. And this is like in New York. So, these people are loud, they have strong opinions, and we just got into a fight, and I left with a bad taste in my mouth. That night was kind of squashed, and the next day I come back on the bus with my friends, I just feel really sour, and I'm like, man, screw these guys. I'm gonna make a blog, and I went and start writing. It sounds so dweeby, but I just started to make the WordPress site and the site and everything. And in the middle, I was like, oh, the Emissary, it sounds cool. And my logo right now, it's not the same as it was back then, but I chose like a falcon, Egyptian falcon raw type logo because it was like, oh, this looks cool too. And, it's like a messenger. So not too much deep thought, to be honest.
No, that's great though. I sort of wish I had done that. So I mean, when I started my consulting firm, Perch Perspectives, which is still sort of doing stuff in the background, I had all these great names or these great ideas for names, and I was working with this PR firm, and they were like, "Yeah, but you can't get a website with that name. So we got to come up with a name that actually works." And I was so crestfallen when we put out. Now this podcast is called Cognitive Dissidence. We're actually going to rebrand soon, but it was originally the Perch Pod. And like one of my first episodes came out, and this guy who I really respected, he emailed me and he said, "Oh, is it going to be a podcast about fishing?" Because he thought it was going to be like perch, and I was just like, "Man, I should have just stuck with something cool and gone from there." All right, we can go down that rabbit hole long enough. Um, Akshar, I mean, you sort of alluded to it, but I find, and this is true of almost any country in general, and this is not just a Western thing. I'm sure the way that sort of India thinks about the United States is as rudimentary as how the United States thinks about India is as rudimentary as how Uruguay interprets Chinese events. So I'm not trying to single out the English press here. It's just I'm in the English language environment, and I will say, relative to almost just about any other country, I find the disconnect between what is actually happening in India and how the West is understanding what is happening in India, there's just a huge chasm there. It feels like there is something that we just fundamentally don't understand. And we are trying to map on all of these Western concepts onto India that just don't work. And they work better in places like, say, Japan, which also has a really sort of unique culture to it. But Japan was conquered by the United States. It's the form of its government. Like you basically grafted on a liberal constitution onto this country. So like there are some pieces where you can compare. That didn't really happen to India in that way in particular. Um, so anyway, I also have enough awareness of my own ignorance to know that I'm not an expert on India, and it would probably take a whole lifetime to even be able to be an expert on one aspect of India, let alone anything else. So I'm hoping that you'll be a regular guest on the podcast, that you'll be a lodestar for us in thinking about Indian politics in general. Obviously, we have a big election coming up, and I do want to sort of back into talking about the election. But the first thing I wanted to talk about, it was great. You have this article on the Emissary, and we're going to link to it in the show notes, called "The Million Minorities Theory of Indian Politics." And it's actually a relatively short article, but you start breaking down some things about, well, what does caste mean in India actually, and how does that map on to the politics of India, and how should we think about what's going on in modern India as a result of these castes and things like that. So I guess the first thing I want to ask you is a little more meta, which is, do you think there is a consensus view of the West when it writes and thinks about and talks about or even invests in India? And what would you want to like if you could change one thing about the way that people talk about India in English language press outside of
Mhm.
India? What would it be? What do you think is the thing that people are missing the most?
The number one problem, I'd say, and I think this is a Anglophone problem when discussing anywhere, they try to determine who are the white people and who are the black people. Essentially, in every single place. All right, who's the oppressor? Who's the oppressed? We're just going to do a black and white history. We're going to transplant, the history of slavery and whatever Native American genocide. Blah blah blah. I think that's a central problem, but the reason there's a bigger disconnect between, say, Western coverage and Indian is one, India has a huge population, so it has a huge number of people to talk to the West. So that's, they have, they're blessed with that in a way. But number two, who are these people? So for most of Indian history, especially since its inception, and I mean the Indian Republic, it was skewed very far left. Like the main opposition was communists, and to the right of them were the socialists, which was Nehru and the Congress Party. So even Nehru himself, he would have to move a bit left just just for political equations. So that happens, and then now they're true blue believers within the Congress Party and within the government, and they start putting that into academia. This happens more so during Indira Gandhi's time, which is I think two or three prime ministers down from Nehru, and also Nehru's daughter. So he does a alliance with the communists, and now they have a lot of access to, academia, bureaucracy, blah blah blah. So in general, Indian elite culture is extremely left skewed in a way that most countries just are not.
Mm.
And a lot of, say, the ground level Indian thought and traditional Indian thought, the thought of the masses and the populace, it's just not there in terms of a lot of the people who could speak English at such a proficient level. Now it's different, but traditionally for the past few decades, and even up till even up till right now, a lot of the best English speaking people in India, they lean very far left. It's a huge disconnect between them and the people. Like they have something more in common. A person from Mumbai, from that crop, has something more in common with someone in Manhattan or Madrid than, outside in the hinterlands of the state of Maharashtra, which is,
Mm.
where Mumbai is. That's, I think, the biggest disconnect. There's always a big leftward skew. And what that means is a bit different in India too. So this is another aspect. Right and left don't map properly in India, or they don't map like they do in America. In India, the left, I think, is very against. I mean, you could say this is a similarity. Like they're against the majority culture, but in Indian history, what happened to the majority culture? This is a big divide between one side and the other side. You could say the Indian left and right. The Indian left believes, at least the center left believes, India was colonized once by the British or Europeans. The Indian right believes it was twice by the British or Europeans, and then the Turks or the Muslims, et cetera, et cetera. So a lot of times you see the Indian left kind of, I don't know, I think they would be downplaying a lot of the Hindu sentiments or Hindu beliefs and Hindu cultural mores about India, just to kind of make a lot of the Muslim minority a lot more comfortable, especially with the backdrop of partition. I know I'm dropping a lot of stuff right now. This is what I meant when, in terms of, you have to think of Indian history. Things 1,000 years ago really do matter in India, and that's a very big anomaly. So we could go into different branches here. I tried to give like a big, broad assessment of why there's a big disconnect.
Yeah, don't apologize. And I mean, the best book about partition that I've read was Midnight's Furies. It was sort of it sort of threaded the needle between being deep but also not being so deep that it sort of made you want to turn off. That's another problem with Indian history. I've like tried to read different books about it, and you sort of get 3 pages in and like you're having to look up every single word in the
Yeah.
dictionary 'cause you have no idea what's going on. Midnight Furies was not that. It took a really nice vignette of partition and sort of the legacy of it. But I think you've already sort of alluded at some of the things that we want to get into deeper here, which was, India is a quote unquote majority Hindu state. It's a Muslim majority state, but one of, if not the largest Muslim populations in the entire world because of how big it is. We've got Sikhs and all other sorts of things in general. But then you also, and I think you make this argument, caste in some ways is more important. Maybe we shouldn't be saying more or less important, but caste is almost just as important as religion. And I think the West understands religion; it does not understand caste, and it's why I think you see so much talk about Hindus versus Muslims versus Sikh versus this, that, and the other thing. And they can't start talking about caste because even somebody like me who does geopolitics for a living, I start reading into the caste, and my mind is spinning. I'm like, I don't know what this word means. I don't know how it relates to this thing or the other. Um, so how do you think about Indian politics? Like, I assume that you have to think about both of these things at the same time, but do you give
Mhm.
one weight, or how do you make them fit together?
Caste is it's very salient when you talk about Hindus and, to a degree, Sikhs. All other religions in India also have caste, but it's probably not as salient. So first, I think you go for religion. So you see, you know, Muslims are very ironclad backing whatever anti-BJP party it is. Usually it's a Congress party, but if there's another party, they'll back it to a hilt, in terms of 80%, 90% backing in a lot of these elections. So that minority element is very big. It happens with Christians and Sikhs too. But now things are starting to change. The BJP is getting some Christian votes in areas like Northeast India. That's a very big development. Even places like Goa. And let's see in the next election that's coming up, maybe there might start cracking the vote in Kerala. So they're starting to shift there in terms of religious votes. They get some Sikh votes in places like Delhi and a bit in Punjab as well. So they're not exactly as majoritarian as people think them to be. What their project is, and this is when we start going into caste. Hindus usually do not vote on religion, especially in state elections. Uh, in national elections, they might, caste might matter less, but still does matter. They don't vote on religion. They usually vote more so on caste, but all Indians in general vote on freebies, especially. That's the first layer. Just get it out of the way. Freebies can nullify a lot of this. Huge stops of welfare can get you votes very quickly and very easily, and better delivery of it as well. But let's go into caste. So yeah, that this million minorities framework. One of my friends on Twitter, he wants to remain anonymous. He kind of tipped me off to this, so I can't say it's all my creation, but he gave me kind of the raw material of it, or like the light bulb moment. But what it is basically it's recognizing that you have these categories: Hindu, Muslim, Sikh, Christian, Buddhist, etc., etc. But in practice, like India is more so a million minorities, and to win an Indian election, you need to get a coalition of these minorities to win. So a classic coalition that worked for a very long time for, say, the Congress Party, for decades actually, they would do a coalition of Muslims. Muslims they're a lot less salient when it comes to caste and stuff. They vote together in a religious sense. So they do a coalition of Muslims. So that's like, 15% of the population at that point. Then they do a coalition. Then they add on people like untouchables or Dalits or SCs. This all means the same thing: SC, Dalit, untouchable. They add on this group, which bumps them up, several percentage points. And then they add on Brahmins, which is a very small group. You've probably heard of them. They're very small numerically, but they do have a lot of influence in terms of, I don't know, politics, and they're kind of like a model minority in a way. Or market dominant minority, whichever one you want to call it. So this, tripartite coalition, it gets them enough of the population, maybe like 25, 30%. And in a parliamentary, democracy, that's how you can win an election. You don't need a 51% mark to break the number. All you need is like 30% or 20 something percent to make a coalition or to make a government. So this is how it works. Now for today, we have to look at the BJP, what the BJP is doing, and that's Hindu nationalism or Hindutva. And the BJP and its kind of ideological, I call it the ideological sugar daddy, but basically their ideological father, the RSS, their biggest idea in terms of Hindu society is Hindu unity. So they see caste as an impediment to unity. They're not super anti-caste, I'll say. Like, they don't want to annihilate or destroy caste because they realize it is really important to a lot of Hindus. Even like so-called lower castes and upper castes, if you look at the stats, they all intermarry or they all marry endogenously at similar rates. Like, there's not that much of a difference between a lower caste getting out, into like marrying out versus an upper caste marrying out. Those rates are really similar. So it's very important to all different castes, all different Hindus. Caste is important because it gives them their traditions, their rituals. It also gives them political power. People mobilize based on caste. People riot based on caste. So it's physical security. It's also economic, business relationships. It's a very big reality, and that's difficult to destroy.
Yeah, let me stop you there. I'm going to ask what seems like a simple question, but it's probably going to light your hair on fire to try and answer it. What is a caste? Try to define it simply, because to me it's a word that resists definition, and I'm betting that some of our listeners are going to be hearing you talk and wanting me to intervene there. So how should we think about caste? How would you define it?
I'll tell you first, in function, you should think of it like an ethnic group. That's the best way you could think of it in India today, and especially Indian politics. It is an identity, it's an ethnic group. Now we go to the background of caste, which is more so, it has historical, ritualistic importance. Many people have probably seen the vertical pyramid of caste. I think that betrays a lot of the complexity of caste and a lot of the heterogeneity of caste. Caste, from genetic studies, it calcified around 500 AD. And Indian history is a lot older than that. So you have an area of Indian history where caste was kind of fluid. Like,
Mm.
people might intermarry a lot more, or people may quote unquote change caste, et cetera, et cetera. And then even after it, became endogamous, and you have all these caste groups who don't intermarry and have, a lot more calcified culture, you have new caste groups emerge. Like, I don't think there are any Patels in like 500 AD. I think they're a more recent phenomenon, and you see that with other groups as well. So it is kind of an evolving and at the same time very structured, uh, phenomenon. And there's multiple aspects of it. The pyramid I told you about is usually 4 or 5 parts, and that's called Varna, and that's the most ancient term of caste. But in reality, what it is today, which is a lot more of a horizontal competition or network or web, that's called Jati. So I'll give you one example, and I'll try not to confuse people. The At the bottom of the pyramid, or the first Varna, is called the Brahmins. Now, Brahmins are across India, but that doesn't mean they all have the same types of rituals. They have a lot of overlap, but say a Brahmin from Tamil Nadu, very south, they'll have certain rituals, and they'll have subsets, a thing called Iyer and Iyengar. These are two different, what we call jatis. So this is the actual ethnic expression of caste. Most people identify with their jati, like, hey, I am a Iyer, I am a Iyengar, I am a Kashmiri Brahmin. And these three groups, or I could even add more types of Brahmins, they have different, diets, different rituals, different traditions. Sometimes they worship different gods, et cetera, et cetera. So jati is the best word in terms of describing caste today in India, because those are those small, homogenous, endogamous ethnic groups which get into that competition that we see in terms of this million minorities framework, where different Hindu castes, they compete with each other. But kind of going back, just to wrap up my earlier point,
Mhm.
why the BJP pushes Hindutva or Hindu nationalism, the number one reason is to make these castes stop fighting each other and to create a grand coalition of these million Hindu minorities, and create, enough of a mandate, enough of a coalition and vote bank to get into power. That's the number one goal of Hindu nationalism. Let's, stop fighting amongst ourselves, and let's get into power to start, pushing Hindu politics and Hindu political persuasions.
You said you sort of compared it to an ethnic group. How is it not like an ethnic group? What makes it different?
That's a good question, because I don't know, to be honest. It's very, very similar to an ethnic group. It has its own culture, own ritual. Oh, I could think of one. Like, you can't tell my caste by looking at me. And that's the same thing in India. Like, if you walk around the street, you really can't tell someone's caste just by looking at them. You could maybe tell region, and even then, that could betray you a lot of times. But caste is not like, an appearance thing as much, I'd say.
Hmm.
Certain people, especially in rural areas, they might wear certain headdresses or turban, or have tattoos or something like that that might denote their caste, but that's a rarity. So I think that's a big difference. You can't tell someone's caste by looking at them.
Yeah. Um, that reminds me of I'm half Jewish, but pretty culturally Jewish in general. And I went through a period where I was thinking about becoming a rabbi and doing all this stuff, and so I was wearing a kippah regularly. And I've been asked a couple times over the past couple of months if I've ever experienced anti-Semitism in my life, and I always. First of all, I know it's always there lurking. But the only time I actually experienced anti-Semitism in my life was when I was living in New York City and I wore a kippah. And if I wore the kippah, like people came up and they would say shit to me that was like really awful. But if I took it off, like I could just pass as just another white American dude from the South. So that's sort of an I don't know interesting thing there. Um, I was looking at a Gallup study while you were talking because I just wanted the exact figures here. And listeners probably know this, but religiosity in the United States has declined considerably. So the percentage of U.S. adults who attend religious services has declined to 30% from 42% 2 decades ago. And there's a huge increase in Americans who are not affiliated with churches or with religion. So that's increased from 9% in 2000 to almost 21% right now. The question I'm leading up to here, and you sort of talked about it with the BJP trying to superimpose Hindu religion on top of the caste so they stop fighting each other. Is Hindu religiosity declining in India? Is caste allegiance declining in India? Like, is the BJP fighting a battle here that it's not going to win? Or is caste beginning to feel obsolete, or people beginning to throw that off? And is the BJP just riding a wave of, oh, there is more of a consolidation of a national identity, versus is it more of a top down thing? And it's, oh, we have this charismatic leader and we need to change this caste system if we're
Yeah.
going to stay in power. Does that question make sense?
Yeah, totally. It's an amazing question. I was thinking of writing an article about this. So one facet you need to think about considering all this is urbanization and the internet. So Indians are more connected than ever before. I guess the third aspect is also highway building, infrastructure in India. So Indians are physically, mentally, emotionally, and even spiritually connected more than ever before. So I'll give you an example. Let's talk about the Hindu aspect first. Firstly, there's a lot more migration in India, especially from the Hindi heartland, so northern India, the most populous area, across India for labor work. So they bring their rituals, their culture, and they kind of spread it throughout. Simultaneously, there's the internet and Instagram and stuff like that that shows a lot of the colorfulness of Indian culture and these religious festivals and things like that. So you actually do see a spreading of like mass religious festivals in India. That's a huge thing that's happening. So places that might be, I'll give you an example. There's a festival called Ganesh Chaturthi, which is a West Indian festival from Maharashtra mainly, and it worships, Ganesha, the elephant-headed god. You've probably seen it before, but this has started to spread throughout India, and this has happened, I think, over the past 100 years, but it's starting to accelerate. Other festivals like Holi, that's the one where people throw colors at each other. That's, I think, traditionally that's more North Indian, but now it's starting to spread throughout India because people are migrating. It looks cool on social media, and I think there's an increase in people identifying with Hinduism as a identity in terms of, like, the best way I could put it is Indians have identity stacks. So what identities do I have? I have my caste, I have my ethnicity, I have maybe my sub-ethnicity, like my linguistic ethnicity, I have my religion, I have my sect. So what's going to be on top of the stack essentially? Now Hinduism just in general is moving to the top of the stack for many people. And I think this is due to a lot of the ground level work that the BJP and the RSS do. This is due to things like, I mean, the biggest push is definitely like Ram Mandir. That's a whole other thing that probably needs its own episode or its own section to talk about. But basically, a temple was built on a very sacred place that Hindus considered where Lord Ram was born. But prior to that, there was a mosque on it, and prior to that, there was a temple on it. I think they've done excavations that they've validated the previous temple. But basically, the mosque was destroyed around 1991. There's a huge, huge churn in Indian politics because of this, and a huge churn in Hindu religiosity because of this. It was recently constructed, and that was I call it India's cultural independence. If like India was politically independent in 1947, then India became culturally independent when that Ram Mandir was inaugurated. That was a huge, huge, huge event across India, and that's where the reason I'm referencing it is because that's where you see the real public religiosity of Indians, where they have these saffron flags everywhere, or they're celebrating and stuff like that. So that definitely increased in terms of Hinduism. But now, and stop me whenever you want a clarification, because I know I could keep going. But now let's talk about caste. Is caste becoming more salient? Caste is becoming more salient in a political sense because there is a pushback against Hindutva and Hindu nationalism. The opposition has kind of understood correctly that to break Hindutva and Hindu nationalism, you need to make castes kind of fight each other. You need to, create discord between these castes. And this is a tactic. So that it is kind of becoming like a rubber band effect where it's kind of snapping back. But I think because of forces like urbanization and the internet, if you talk to young Indian Zoomers in India, like when I traveled to India, I talked to a lot of them. Caste is becoming a lot less important in these urban centers, and especially people are starting to meet. Say, I think dating apps is a small phenomenon, but just say the internet. People are meeting on the internet. People are meeting in school. You're having a lot more broad-based, people from lower castes and more disadvantaged positions in society. They're getting access to education, access to these elite areas now, and they're starting to intermarry. Class is becoming a lot more important than caste. And another facet I'd say is the religious element of caste is lessening as well. Like a lot of Brahmins may not remember a lot of their very complex rituals, like these young Brahmins and stuff. And that's true for all castes. Like religiosity from a caste point of view is lessening. Now I think religiosity from a general Hindu or sect point of view is increasing. So it's being replaced. So this element of caste is starting to lessen. You're starting to see more intermarriage in places like cities. And even curiously enough, I think places where Hindu nationalism gets stronger, it also is going to start lessening. Like Gujarat is a really good example of this. It has one of the higher intercaste marriage rates, and it's known as like, ground zero for Hindutva. It's like the heartbeat for a lot of Hindu nationalism today. And that's where Modi is from. That's where a lot of big leaders in terms of the BJP are from as well. So, yeah, there's a snack back effect politically, but I think in the long term, because of modernity, urbanization, just the way India is moving, maybe even Hindu nationalism a little bit, caste is going to start becoming less important. We're going to see a lot more intercaste people in India. But
As I was prepping for this podcast, I haven't read this book yet, but I sort of skimmed
mhm.
the first chapter of it. It's written by Meera Nanda, and it's The God Market: How Globalization is Making India More Hindu.
Oh wow,
And
okay.
the argument, and it's funny, it was published in 2011, and the argument is that whereas conventional wisdom says globalization and integration into the global marketplace usually weakens the power of traditional faith, it's actually the opposite in India. And sort of the book talks about this state temple corporate complex and about how sort of Hinduism in itself has become this capital accumulation and production scheme, and also this way to pry the hands of the state maybe off the
Mhm.
economy. But the question in there, but as we finish this up, or at least this part of the conversation, is like is it Hinduism and religiosity is increasing at the expense of caste? Is it an Indian national identity and we're just going to call that Hinduism? Is it possible to disentangle those things? I guess I'm wondering if the average Indian is getting more religious, because that's
Mhm.
almost, I don't really know of anywhere in the world where the population is getting more religious, but that seems to be kind of what's happening here, and it's happening alongside like getting rid of the caste part of this, which is also religious in
Mhm.
its own element.
Mhm. That's a good question. I think Hinduism is intricately tied to the Indian Republic now, um, for whatever reason. Well, for the reason is because India is regarded as like a sacred divine land. Like people worship the land and they regard it as divine. I know there's a lot of pollution in India, but at the end of the day, like this is also true too. Both things are simultaneously true. Um, so Indian national identity is getting stronger for sure. Uh, Hinduism as a political identity is getting stronger. I think that's a better way to put it. It's people are a lot more politically aware and put it on top of their identity stack. In terms of religiosity, say doing more rituals, following more traditions, um, even say going to temples and observing fasts, just normal religious stuff. I can't say with I can't say confidently that's going up. I think public displays of religiosity are going up, but say private observation of Hinduism, I'm not sure. I've heard mixed things. Like I've heard a lot of Zoomers and young millennials, they're starting to get more into it. Um, but I think like I'll give you kind of a history analogy I do. In around like 500 BC to 1000 BC, India urbanized. It's second urbanization, they call it. And during this time, there's a massive change in how Indian religion was observed and how it was thought of. This is when Buddhism and Jainism pop up. This is when the Buddha was born. And this is when you see these bands of wandering monks across India, and you see these cities popping up, and you see people starting to think different about the old orthodoxies of Hinduism and or Dharma in general, like Buddhism, Jainism, and Hinduism together, just called Dharma. And from that, you see even Hinduism change. So it takes aspects of Buddhism and Jainism. Obviously, Buddhism, Jainism, they take aspects from Hinduism. They all mix, they all coagulate. And then at the end of the urbanization, or as it goes on, you do see a kind of evolved Hinduism. And I think Hinduism is very good at that. It's good at evolving, but keeping a core. It has a bit of flexibility and pluralism. So I think that's what's happening in India from a religious perspective. There are some traditions that are going to die out, but there are many that are still going to stay. Like India fundamentally is still a conservative society.
That's interesting in a very sort of strange way. That's sort of like how the United States is able to assimilate immigrants. I mean, it's in a very different sort of context, but that's I hadn't really thought about that before.
Mhm.
Um, I want to get into your ideologues versus identitarians, but before we get there, I thought it would be useful to talk a little bit about just how much of India is still agricultural and the relationship between land and some of the things that we're talking about. Also, before I forget, by the way, I had such a huge crush on a Jain girl at one point in my life, and she wouldn't give me the time of day. And I went down this rabbit hole, like trying to understand everything there was
uh,
about Jains. And I
did he
loved that
become
it was
vegetarian?
I did not go that far. If she had expressed more interest, maybe I would have.
Yeah,
But I loved that it was a religious minority that was even smaller than the Jews. There are not many out
yeah,
there that have that sort of outsized impact. And then you look at the figures, and it's like, wow, there's only 5 million of these folks. Like that's
yeah.
like the statistical variance on the Indian census, probably. Anyway, you noted in your article that 43% of the workforce in India is still involved in agriculture. And you even go so far as to say that much of India has yet to escape the clutches of feudalism. And talking about how castes and feudal lords are still like sort of at the top of this thing. A couple of stats of my own to throw in there. I mean, this is the primary source of livelihood for 58% of the population. We're talking fairly rudimentary agriculture. Agriculture, by the way, that is based largely on the whims of the monsoon cycle, which is changing as a result of climate change. 66% of India's population still live in rural areas. 70% of rural households are farmers, and the vast majority of them are small and relatively poor. And I've noticed, Modi, when he came to power, was promising a lot of agricultural reforms. And while he's done many things and achieved many things that I think nobody thought possible, every time he tries to mess with agricultural reform, which I think is badly needed in India, he gets smacked upside the face and he gets
Yeah.
protests and he has to turn around and he can't do it. So even the most popular figure, arguably in modern Indian history, like anytime he goes at this, like it's sort of a hot button issue. We could spend an entire hour just talking about this, but I wanted to ask, because we've talked about caste and religion, how does land sort of fit into this? Like, is caste associated with land? Is religion associated with land? Is land sort of a separate thing? Because I feel like
Mhm,
even in terms of property and agriculture and things like that, the definitions are completely different than a Western context.
mhm. I think obviously that Hinduism worships the land. There's like if you go to a random village, you'll see a random hill that people worship because some saint or some god walked there. There will be a small little temple on there, so that's very connected. But I think land in India should be viewed more from a political and economic and caste angle. Caste probably the least, but still important, or maybe equally. But we could talk that. We could get into that. Firstly, the issue is land records, I think, are very shoddy. So now there's room for a lot of corruption and there's room for a lot of physical violence to take land grabbing. So that's issue number one. So, how do you do that? You mobilize a bunch of angry young men. What's the best way to mobilize a bunch of angry young men? Caste. So, usually, they're called dominant landed castes or dominant castes many times. And this is the thing that'll start making people's heads spin. So they'll be like, oh, they must be, super high upper caste. It must be the Brahmins or something like that, or some of the people at the top. And a lot of times it's not. Most of the time it's not actually. It's usually these people at the bottom of the caste pyramid or almost at the bottom of the caste pyramid in terms of that old Varna pyramid we were talking about. So these landed castes, they're peasants or they're landlords essentially that eventually grew into power. And the farm laws are a great example of this, and it shows you the real regionality and almost specificity of India here. So Modi enacted the farm laws. They would have reformed and liberalized a lot of the land, given access to a lot more people, as well as allowed corporates to come in, and that gave a lot of fear to a lot of farmers, especially landlords. So a lot of India was kind of fairly open to it or ambivalent to it. I think a lot of these farmers across India were mostly ambivalent to it, if not maybe a little bit perturbed, but not too crazy about it, like not protesting. The protests mostly happened around Delhi, and it's due to this specific caste called the Jats. Now, the Jats are in places like Punjab, Haryana, and Western Uttar Pradesh. Uh, these are all states in India surrounding Delhi. And this caste has a lot of land ownership and power. And, due to that, some of them have gotten rich. Many of them are also involved in the military. There's a long tradition of Jats joining the Indian military. So they have a very fierce and proud tradition in terms of being farmers and soldiers. But they also have extracted a lot from the government. During the Green Revolution, which was, I think, in the 1960s or 70s in India, India was facing a lot of, acute food shortages. So because of the Green Revolution, innovations in farming and, farming technology and crop yield, areas such as this, Punjab, Haryana, and Western UP, under the control of these Jats, these farming castes, they produced a lot of wheat and a lot of food stuff for India. So the government also helped them with subsidies and things like this. And if the farm laws went into effect, a lot of these subsidies or a lot of these, benefits would kind of have been taken away. So now, what do the Jats do who are most affected by these farm laws? They start like protesting, rioting. Eventually, you've seen like the tractor protests that go into India and stuff like that. There was also a small religious element of Sikh Jats, and there's some ethnic chauvinism. There's an ethnic angle. There's a religious angle. I think I think Modi at that point, he just realized that, hey, this is just not worth it. Maybe we should just do state level reforms. So by mobilizing this caste who had these subsidy benefits or had cornered a market, by mobilizing this caste, they just thwarted the reform, and this could happen across India on various reforms, especially related to land. I don't know if Modi tried to do a land reform. I think he tried to do a labor reform, possibly land as well, very early in his term. But he kind of realized that I can't do this because I'm going to lose electorally. There's probably going to be violence, and I think that's the difficult part. This relationship between caste having power over land and cornering a market or cornering an economic element or pie, and the reform destroying this, domination, and then the reaction to that, the electoral, the political, the social reaction to it. So, yeah.
Yeah, and that's the perfect segue into where I hope we'll spend the rest of the podcast talking, and where we'll pick up next time, which is this idea that you've crafted of ideologues versus identitarians. And I'll let you explain the concept, but in the metaphor that we just talked about, Modi is the ideologue. He has the grand unifying theory of how to stitch India together, and if you get reforms, maybe you have greater food independence, and then India can be self-reliant. Like he goes down that route, and then he faces these specific groups that are like, we were for you in general in the election, but we're not for you on this. We're going to make your life very, very difficult if you go down this route. So he sort of lost the pulse of the identitarians. And the thing about Modi is that he's had his finger on the pulse of the largest swath of these Indian minorities, arguably than any other Indian figure. I mean, you sort of correct me if I'm wrong there.
Yeah.
So maybe sort of build out that ideologue versus identitarian thing, and then maybe we can take a step back and put this in context of the current election and where Modi goes from here.
Mm-hmm. So, like I said before, the first, circle or loop Indians go through when they decide to vote are probably freebies or maybe economic reasons. So that's easy to explain enough. Now we're through that. The next is usually identitarian. Some groups say if one is more urban or educated, maybe a bit less. But I think we could just say in general, Indians are very identitarian in terms of voting. So each, minority, and again, going from that million minorities framework, Hinduism, let's break it down into a bunch of castes or a bunch of ethnic groups, and et cetera, et cetera. Let's just view all Indians as a bunch of minorities. So each minority or each Indian ethnic group or identity, they have, certain wants and certain asks for their identity, whether it's the example we gave before about a market domination, or it could be, political representation. It could be something like law and order. In places like Uttar Pradesh in northern India, they used to have, and they still have, issues with law and order, where basically whatever government came in would be catering to the gangsters of a certain caste. This especially happens with this caste called the Yadavs. and this party called the Samajwadi Party. But I don't want to get too deep into that. Yeah, it's basically Indians vote based on identity, but how do you get all these, fighting people into a certain coalition? That's where the ideologues come in. Now, the ideologues will know that, hey, I'm probably not going to get everything I want, but I could balance all these people through an umbrella of an ideology. So for the BJP, that's Hindutva or Hindu nationalism, where they say, okay, we see all these caste groups. We see some of you guys even have issues with each other. We're going to try to give you as much representation in our government, in our posts. We're going to try to address your areas as much as we can. And at the end of the day, if you join us, then, the people on the other side, your enemies, whether that's an enemy caste or increasingly when it comes to Hindutva, the other so-called is usually the Muslim or some minority. They're not going to mess with you. You're going to do better than them. So yeah, basically these identitarians, they keep competing with each other. They need an ideologue to round them up and be like, hey, we're going to answer your short-term needs. Just play with us or give us some leeway in terms of long-term needs. So I'll try to give a concrete example. On the other side, I think is even more stark, because the other side is usually headed by these left-wing elites, these very intellectual types, very posh people. They speak Hindi, or they speak English with a certain accent. They would not be caught dead in a random village in India that has that barely has sanitation or anything like that. But these people ally with some of the most parochial and village bumpkin people in India, and some of these castes as well. And why is that? Well, in many times their whole MO is look, we're just gonna leave you the hell alone. We just want your vote. We're gonna leave you alone. You guys can corner your market. You guys can do your kind of gangsterism. You guys can do your landlordism. Blah blah blah. We're not gonna really bother you guys. You guys can keep doing your caste fights, whatever. However, let me change your textbook, or let me give this benefit to some of the Muslims. Let me do this type of appeasement, or let me pay these religious officials, usually say pastors or Muslim religious leaders, a bit more. Basically, let me enact my ideology, and I'll leave you alone for the most part. Most of my changes aren't going to affect you. Or let me do this certain law that is maybe not going to be as advantageous to Hindus in general. So these types of things, I think, are how it operates. Or I guess even a better example is, say, economics, like socialism especially. I think the left wing, they implement these types of things a bit more. So yeah, it's basically giving short-term benefits to these identitarians so that identitarians will tolerate long-term changes. Now, sometimes it's just backfire, like the farmers' protests. A large part of these farmers' protesters, not all of them, were traditionally Modi or BJP voters. So that's another reason he also backed off. So it could go haywire too.
Yeah, and this is sort of getting into we're not going to talk in depth about the election here, but this is the frame that I wanted to talk about the election and how people should be thinking about it upcoming, because it seems to me that Modi is incredibly popular and he has incredible approval ratings for somebody who's few leaders in democracies have approval ratings like Modi has. At the same time, though, if you look at what he's promised in terms of reforms and what he's actually been able to enact, I would call it a fairly disappointing record. And it's this sobering realization that if even this guy can't pass through some of these important reforms, how is India going to do these things that will allow it to achieve its potential and become this sort of great world power that Modi is really articulating? And I guess my question there is, Modi's the most successful ideologue that we've had in modern Indian history. The first question is he's obviously going to win the election upcoming, but has he been able to get enough of the identitarians to go along with him that in this term he'll be able to push things through in such a way that whoever comes next can't just reverse it? Build a new
Mm-hmm.
coalition against him and go back against him against his ideological leanings? Has he coalesce something there in general? And then how much of this do you think is just Modi himself, who is an incredibly charismatic figure, or is this a trend in general, or is there going to be a next Modi, and that really
Mhm.
the Hindu nationalism that he has helped build is not really going to be challenged in any meaningful way because of the way that the numbers
Mhm.
are working?
Modi, I think Modi's kind of convinced me of like the great man theory in many ways. He's definitely pushed Indian society in a way that I wasn't expecting. Um, so he's shifted the Overton window a lot, and I'll give you an example. And let's talk about Hindu nationalism or just Hindu-ness, how Hinduism is perceived in India. Prior to Modi, a lot of left-wing or Congress Party leaders, many times they wouldn't go to like Hindu temples during campaign season. They
Mm,
wouldn't participate in a lot of Hindu rituals. They wouldn't even during say the inauguration of certain places. Traditionally in India, when you open a new building, you do like a little worship. It's called a puja, and you do a little ritual to sanctify it or something. A lot of times this wouldn't happen. It used to happen a bit before, but for whatever reason, the Congress Party became the type of party to not try to engage in this stuff. They would call that secularism. But they would participate in minority rituals and stuff. This type of stuff is what really fueled Hindu nationalism in India. Now, though, all across the board, all parties participate in this type of stuff. Like Rahul Gandhi goes to temples all the time. He gets made fun of for it because you can see he's clearly a bit disconnected and he doesn't know what he's doing. But he makes the effort, and that wouldn't have happened before. All opposition candidates pretty much do this. They're trying to, in many ways, out Hindu the BJP, and that's how you know you kind of won ideologically when your opponent starts bending the knee. And like I said, again, Ram Mandir is another great example. Most opposition parties were against it. Even many still boycotted it. But the reason they provided for boycotting the inauguration was that, oh, this is a political event. We revere Lord Ram, but we can't participate in this. We're always for Ram Mandir and stuff like this. So you see the opposition bending the knee. That being said, the biggest danger to, I think, Hindutva or Hindu nationalism is something I call Jatitva. And it comes from, that word jati, that caste. Um, like I said, that rubber band effect, that snapback, that's real. Like right now, Rahul Gandhi and the opposition, their kind of plan is like, hey, we need to agitate the lower sections of Indian society. As India develops, it is becoming more, unequal. That's how developing countries work. And also now there's social media and people see what rich Indians are doing. People see the wealth
mm,
on their phones when they're in, this little like 4x4 shack. And they're like, why is that not me? Those type of visuals, I don't think were there before in India. And I think that does change people psychologically. And even when I was traveling in India, I traveled for a few months and I talked to people in slums or, drivers or on ground in villages and stuff. There was starting to be a palpable anger against like, hey, are we being left behind? You know, yeah, the country's moving forward, but I see all these people being so, they're enjoying it way more than me. So now there is on the opposition side, and I think Modi will address this in term three. He's going to have to do a bunch of freebies too, I think, and solve some of this, unequal pain. But on the opposition side, they are pushing back against Hindutva or Hindu nationalism with this idea of, hey, we are our caste first. And Hindutva or Hindu nationalism, it's a conspiracy or it's a swindle to, trick us into buying into this myth of Hindu unity. And our caste is going to be less well off if we buy into this Hindu unity because, it's actually for the other caste. And they kind of do this with almost every caste. So it's a crazy thing where every caste gets pissed off, but it's mostly focused. I think it mostly resonates with lower caste or caste that's being left behind. Um, so that's definitely something happening in the election that could be a threat to this, Overton shift, where Modi may have to take a step back. And you even see that nowadays where he's starting to mention his own caste. He's a OBC or other backwards class or caste, I think. Before he used to never really mention that. That's the biggest bureaucratic caste grouping in India. Um, Before he never used to mention that, but now he's starting to put up that shield and be like, hey, I'm, if you want to talk about lower caste, I'm the biggest lower caste, or I'm the biggest leader of lower caste India's ever seen, or at least in modern times. So he's going to have to dance a bit. But I think on a net, two steps forward, one step back, India is moving towards Hindu nationalism and Hindutva as like a core ideology. So I think that's going to stay. But post Modi, that's a very dangerous time, I think, for I'd say India in general, because of I think this redistribution rhetoric and this kind of caste rhetoric, it could be very like I compare it to like Lebanon and Rwanda, where you have these groups at each other's throats. I don't know if you've heard of like Lebanese confessionalism, where each group is, it's a quota for almost every single political position, and sometimes in economic places or businesses. That's what's being proposed in India. Stuff like that can really, I think, throw off the Indian growth story and create a lot of animosity. And even now, if you hear some of the rhetoric that's emanating from the opposition, um, you see a lot of hatred towards, say, general caste or upper caste or certain castes. And on the flip side, like I'm not going to absolve BJP and the Modi of not engaging in, anti-Muslim rhetoric as well. But I think it is fair to say that they've been saying that at least this campaign season more in reaction to this caste rhetoric rather than doing it on the front foot. I think that is a fair thing to say.
It's interesting you say that. One of the themes of the podcast this year so far has been, so I've been reading about and doing research about the Democratic Republic of Congo and Rwanda and sort of the big wars in Africa in the late 1990s. And it's funny, I didn't bring it up when I asked you about caste, but there are like weird overtones to Hutus and Tutsis. Like when you actually get down to what those things mean and how they got grafted on and how a conflict became so deadly so fast and led to genocides and counter genocides and all these other rebellious movements. We don't think of that happening in the Indian context. But to your point, I mean, if you want to craft a negative scenario, just go back to how bloody partition was and how quickly people turned on each other in that sense. And I take your point exactly right there on the Muslim population. I mean, the Kashmir thing is still sort of hanging there in the background, and I don't know how that all works in, or how once you remove the great man at the top of the pyramid that everybody trusts, like that was sort of my question: is there somebody who can fill that void? Because right now, like it almost feels like Modi is doing it through force of personality, and I don't know if he's going to be able to move the country far enough by the time he's not the leader to prevent that sort of snapback. I mean, that would be
Yeah.
the negative scenario. And I know you're not negative on India. So where's the silver lining? Where's the optimism? Because that's a dark path that we just peaked down.
I think one thing Modi has done is he has made a lot of institutional change in India, whether it's in the bureaucracy and or the armed forces, or just culturally and business leaders and things like that. People have expectations of, hey, like we want better governance, we want our welfare delivered on time in our bank accounts, we want roads, we want infrastructure development. And one of the ways that's happening, I think this especially happened after the failure of the farm reforms, is Modi and the BJP were like, okay, like we took a big L here. How are we going to change this? And that's where competitive federalism has started to emerge, where they enacted some of these farm reforms in states. Now they can't enact it to the same, big effect, but things like this in states like in Western and Southern India, and a lot of these states aren't all ruled by the BJP. They're also ruled by some opposition parties, some neutral parties, et cetera, or they switch hands to the Congress. But either way, Western and Southern states in India have started to provide a framework for governance and an idea that even when, say, people from Northern India visit or migrate or, they're tourists too, they see how these states function and they start to think like, hey, why can't that be us? We deserve this too. So I think Indian society is starting to expect better governance. That's one thing. Number two, say succession. You can't really predict what Modi's going to do. There are some candidates for succession, and most of them culturally, they are probably to the right of him in terms of culture. So they're more Hindu nationalists, or they have a bit more bite to them. People like Amit Shah, he's his right hand man. They're like they can never be separated, but he's a big one. I think he's the home minister right now of India, and he's a big election guy. He did a lot of election crafting for the BJP. So he's one candidate. Yogi Adityanath is the one that makes people shiver in the West, especially. But Yogi has gotten his one thing that's going for Yogi is he is heading India's most wily state, Uttar Pradesh. It has a population of the size of Brazil, and it's notorious for the breakdown of law and order, caste wars, religious violence, et cetera, et cetera. Yogi is to the right of Modi culturally. However, he is starting to get his chops in order in terms of the governance of UP. If someone can govern UP, they can pretty much govern India. And with that type of, credential, he might get into the spot. And there are a lot of other candidates, but I think the BJP is making an organization like, do you watch soccer
Yeah, a
or
little bit.
football?
Yeah.
Barcelona is famous for La Masia. That it's this institution. It's basically like this training camp or this institution in Barcelona where they teach these footballers or soccer players from a very young age up till they start playing on the Barcelona team. The BJP and the RSS, combined together, they do kind of have a La Masia in terms of politicians and some of these leaders. And there's a lot of people in the second run who will not be as big as Modi. And I'm not even talking about Amit Shah or Yogi Adityanath. Neither of them will be as big as Modi. But there are people in the second rung who are, getting popular in their states. They're starting to deliver. They're becoming their own brand. And I think I think they'll be able to take the reins. They will have a much more difficult time, but they will be able to take the reins to ensure stability, which is the number one most important thing, and make sure India doesn't, the India story doesn't veer off. They're not going to have the mandate of Modi, but they will be able to provide some sense of stability to ensure India doesn't go crazy, essentially.
Yeah, you just breezed by this, but I just want to underscore it. So you talked about Uttar Pradesh, a
Yeah.
state the size of Brazil. So like just
Yeah.
let that sink in for a second, listeners. Like that's a state that's literally the size of Brazil, which is the last question that I'll get you out on. And there's no way we're going to sort of answer this in full. But I mean, it seems I'm going to create a false binary that the truth is probably going to be somewhere in between. But it seems to me you could have rising Hindu nationalism, this Indian state that is more coherent than it has been before because caste gets downgraded and Hindu nationalism gets elevated. But the other path I think that you've articulated, I mean, you called it competitive federalism, which almost sounds like a euphemism for civil war for me. And when you think about the grand scope of Indian history, it begins with the partition of Pakistan. Then Bangladesh breaks off of Pakistan in the 1970s. Like, do you think that parts of India will break off and that it will eventually congeal down into a more manageable state? Or do you think that, if we're talking here 20 years from now, that the borders are roughly the same and that something internal has changed in India from that perspective? Or is it
Hmm.
just going to be, hey, whoever comes up with the right level of freebies and
Hmm.
handouts at the right time is going to be the one who sits on top of this crazy tapestry of different minorities?
Hmm. So competitive federalism, I would say it's more of a net positive for the Indian Union, and I guess good governance in general. Like competitive federalism will spread good governance across Indian states. I think mostly. I think some Indian states and Indian ethnicities they'll get a bit angry, but eventually they get out of that jealousy and they're like, hey, let's do the same thing. So I'm not too worried about competitive federalism balkanizing India. India's balkanization is the lowest it's ever, the chance is the lowest it's ever been and probably will be in the future because the Indian state has centralized strongly under Modi. And the central government, at the end of the day, like secessionism is something the Indian state takes very seriously. And initially, they do give a long rope to secessionists, in my opinion. And they do a lot of background finesse work. Like the reason Kashmir hasn't really blown up ever since they took away Article 370, its special rights and stuff like that, and terrorism has mostly gone down statistically, and investments gone in. The government or the center did a lot of background kind of engineering in terms of some of the political parties there, some of the big figures there. They infiltrated terror groups, they infiltrated certain civil society groups, and now you see a lot of people. I think there are two names. One is named Shah Faisal, the other is Sheila Rashid, who are super anti Indian government, anti center, anti BJP and Modi prior, but now they're all like super pro India. They're like, oh, removing Article 370 is really, really great. So you see all these very strange things happening in Kashmir where the secession was kind of put down. There's still some incidents right now, and there will be for a while, but the Indian state is very uh, good at finessing at least the initial elements of squashing a secession. But when it really comes down to it, they have huge overwhelming force with the Indian military, and I think a huge mandate with the Indian people. Indian people take Indian secession very seriously, so I don't see any risk of balkanization, even if it goes down the path of say like the opposition of Jatitva, of regionalism, and redistribution. This will hurt India a lot, but at the end of the day, whoever's ruling India wants the entire piece of the pie. They want all of India. They want to extract from all of India, and they will use the Indian army to its full effect. And the Indian army, the soldiers as well as the people, will support that as well, I think. So very little risk of balkanization.
Okay, we will leave it there. Thanks for your time, Akshar, and we're going to have you back. I hope you're good for your offer.
Oh, definitely, man.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast, brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor.